I'm sure you've stumbled across those intimidating node tree tutorials with nodes everywhere and thought, I'm not ready for this yet. I can tell you, I've been there and I had to learn it the hard way. Here's the thing. Nodes don't have to be complicated. In fact, when you set them up the right way, they actually make color grading simpler, faster, and way more organized. Today I'm gonna show you how nodes work, how to set them up the right way, and how to build your own node tree from scratch. We'll also cover how to save it so you can reuse it on every project. By the end of this tutorial, you'll have a clean professional workflow that will speed up your grading and keep your projects organized. Let's not waste any more time and let's jump right in. Before we jump into nodes, we need to set up our color management. When it comes to color science in DaVinci Resolve, you've got a few options: a color managed workflow, a non-managed one, and ACEs. The color managed workflow is more automated. Resolve handles all the color space conversions for you. All you need to do is tell it what camera you are using. For example, if your clip is Apple log, just set the input color space to Apple log, and Resolve takes care of the rest. That sounds intuitive, and it is, but I prefer a more flexible approach, DaVinci RGB. This lets me build the color pipeline manually using nodes. Don't worry if that sounds complicated, we'll build the node tree together step by step in just a moment. But first, let's tweak a couple more settings. First one is your timeline color space. I recommend using DaVinci Wide Gamut. It's a massive color space, larger than most camera gamuts, which gives you more room for clean and precise color grading. The second setting is the output color space. This defines your display color space, and it depends on your grading monitor setup. If you are grading for web, go with Rec 709 Gamma 2.2. For broadcast, use Gamma 2.4, and if you are grading on a Mac, choose Rec 709A. You can check out my previous video on Apple Gamma shifts, where I break down exactly why I use Rec 709A. Now let's head over to the color page and start building our node tree. But before we dive in, I want to quickly explain how nodes actually work in DaVinci Resolve, especially if you are coming from Photoshop or Premiere Pro. In those apps, adjustments are made using layers, stacked on top of each other. In Resolve, we use nodes, which process from left to right, not bottom to top. Think of it like building a pipeline. Each section of the pipe represents a different adjustment: exposure, white balance, saturation, and so on. The image flows through this pipeline from one node to the next, so if you reduce saturation in the first node, that change gets passed along. You can bring that saturation back in a later node. It's a one-way flow. You'll notice small rectangles in the node graph. The one with the green dot on the left is your source, and the one on the right is your output. Everything in between is your custom-built color grading pipeline. Now let's break down the different types of nodes in DaVinci Resolve. The most basic one is the serial node. It's straightforward, used for sequential corrections where each node builds on the one before it. Think of it as a simple step-by-step flow. Exposure in one node, contrast in the next, and so on. Next, we have the parallel node. This lets you apply multiple corrections simultaneously, but independently from the same image source. Imagine two pipes running side by side, each doing its own processing and then merging back into one flow. Parallel nodes are especially useful for secondary adjustments. For example, one parallel node can desaturate the image, while another can bring the saturation back in. I use parallel nodes in few scenarios, for example, when combining power windows. You can stack multiple parallel nodes, each with its own power window and specific adjustment, like exposure, tint, or saturation. The results from all those nodes are then blended together in a single unified image. This lets you isolate and tweak different areas of the frame independently, without affecting each other, while still keeping a clean and organized node tree. Next, we have layer node. I'll be honest, I'm not a biggest fan of layer nodes, but they can be useful in specific cases. As you now know, parallel nodes blend multiple adjustments together. Layer nodes, on the other hand, don't blend, they replace. They are actually more comparable to Photoshop layers, where one layer sits on top of another. Unlike parallel nodes, where the order doesn't really matter, the layer node's priority is given to the top layer. And here's where it gets a little weird. In Resolve, when you add a new layer node, it appears below the others, but it actually behaves like the top of the stack. So just remember, in the layer mixer, the lowest connection is the top layer. It might sound confusing at first, but you'll get used to it quickly. So, how do I actually use layer nodes? If you try to adjust something in the bottom layer and nothing happens, that's normal. Remember, the top layer gets priority. That means the bottom layer is effectively being replaced, unless you separate them using keying or power windows. For example, let's say in the bottom layer I create a dark blue look for entire image, a sort of stylized grade. Then in the top layer I can key out the subject's skin, isolating it from the grade. Now both layers are doing something different, and to blend them together I used the Key tab to control how much of each layer comes through. This gives me precise control over how the look is applied across different parts of the image. Next, we have the outside node, and this one's really simple to understand. Here's a straight example. Let's say I select my subject using a power window and make some adjustments, maybe tweak the exposure or color. But now I want to adjust everything except the subject. This is where the outside node comes in. It creates a separate node with the opposite selection, everything outside the power window. That's it, super simple but really useful for clean, controlled adjustments. And lastly, we have the shared node. This one isn't found in the Add Node menu. Instead, you can convert any existing node into a shared node. Shared nodes are super useful when you want to apply the same adjustment across multiple clips. For example, I use them for things like noise reduction or indication. The key feature of a shared node is this: when you make a change to one instance of it, that change is automatically applied to every other clip using the same shared node. That means you don't have to copy-paste grades or manually sync changes, it all stays linked. Here's a quick example. Let's say I apply a weird magenta tint to my first clip. I can right-click that node and choose Save as Shared Node. Then I go to the second clip, right-click and choose Add Shared Node and select the one I just saved. By default, shared nodes are locked, so you'll need to unlock them to see or modify the results. But once you do, any changes made to the one shared node will instantly update across all clips that use it. It's a great way to keep things consistent across your project, especially when you are applying the same correction over and over again. Now that we've covered all the main type of nodes, we can finally start building our node tree. Since we selected DaVinci Y RGB as our color science, that means we'll be doing our color space conversions manually. In other words, Resolve isn't handling the color science for us. We have full control. So let's say we are grading Apple log footage. By default, it's going to look washed out and flat, because that's how the log footage is designed. It preserves dynamic range, but isn't meant for direct viewing. This is where conversion nodes come in. We'll use these nodes to transform the footage from log to a proper display referred image, so we can actually see what we are working with on the monitor. Now, you could use a manufacturer-provided LUT for this, but in many cases LUTs are either inaccurate or too limited. Thankfully, DaVinci Resolve offers powerful and precise tools for this kind of color space conversion, and we'll use those instead. These are called Color Space Transform plugins. And the good news is, they are built in right into DaVinci Resolve. So for our first conversion, let's create two separate nodes and apply a Color Space Transform plugin to each one. In the first node, we are going to tell DaVinci Resolve what the hell our footage actually is. In this case, it's Rec 2020 and Apple log. Basically, we are identifying the camera's input color space and gamma. Then, we will convert it into the white color space we selected earlier in our settings, DaVinci White Gamut. This step is super important, especially if you are working with footage from different cameras. It brings everything into the same unified color space, like putting all your clips into one big pot, so they are speaking the same color language. In the second node, we'll convert this big pot, our working color space, into a proper display color space, so we can actually see it the way it's meant to be viewed or graded. So in this case, I'm setting the output color space to Rec 709, and for the gamma, since I'm planning this to grade for the web, I'll select gamma 2.2. That way, the image will appear correctly on most standard monitors and web platforms, giving us a clean and consistent baseline for grading. Now, most beginners would start grading right after this conversion, or sometimes even right after applying a LUT. This type of workflow is called display referred grading, and while it's common, it's not very intuitive. Why? Because at that point, we've already pinned our large big pot color space down to a much smaller display space like Rec 709. And that means a lot of color information and dynamic range is already gone. That's why I prefer working in a scene-referred color grading workflow, where all the creative adjustments are done between the input and output conversions. This is the sweet spot, right here in the middle, where we still have access to the full dynamic range and rich color data from the camera. Now, I do make a few minor tweaks after the output conversions, but we'll get into those in a minute. Alright, so now that our conversions are properly set up, it's time to start building our actual node tree. The first block in this tree is the most fundamental, and it's arguably the most important. It's called Primaries. In color grading, primaries are the basic adjustments that affect the whole image. These are the big important changes you make at the start, like fixing exposure, contrast, white balance and saturation. Think of them as the foundation of your grade before you start doing anything more specific or creative. Primary corrections are your big picture tweaks. They establish the tonal range and the overall mood of the image before you move on to any targeted or selected refinements. Usually this block is made up of 2 to 4 nodes depending on how modular you want your workflow to be. Let's start with exposure. I'll create a separate node just for that. Now, there are tons of ways to control exposure in Resolve, but if you want the most natural and photometric results, I recommend using the HDR exposure slider. It gives you results that feel very close to what you'd get by adjusting exposure in camera. Next, we want to shape the overall tonal look of the image, and for that, we'll adjust the contrast. You could do this in the same node as exposure, but for more control, I'm creating a separate node and naming it contrast. Now, here's a small but important detail. The middle grade point in the sweet spot of the DaVinci wide gamut color space sits at 0.336. So I'll set the pivot slider to that value and then simply use the contrast slider to dial in the look. Of course, there are other ways to shape tonality in Resolve, like using curves, lift gamma gain wheels, but for this video, let's keep it simple and clean. Next, we need to get to the neutral starting point. And you've probably guessed it, the next step is balance. I usually tweak balance after setting exposure, but I like to place the balance node first in my node tree. So for this, I'll simply right-click on the exposure node and select Add Serial Before. That adds a new node just before exposure, giving us a clean place to adjust balance. Now, there are lots of ways to tweak your white balance in Resolve. Most beginners go straight to the temp and tint sliders, but honestly, they are not most precise tools out there. Instead, I recommend using the offset wheel, or even better, I've got something a bit more advanced and powerful for you. But before I show you that, let me explain another cool thing you can do with nodes. In Resolve, you can actually change the color space and gamma for each individual node. How cool is that? For example, some color adjustments behave much more smoothly and intuitively when working in linear gamma. That's why I like to do my balance corrections in linear gamma. It gives you very clean and natural results. To do this, just right-click on the node you want to change, go to Gamma and select Linear. Now, when I use the gain wheel, it acts more like a precise, intuitive offset control, letting me gently shift the entire image to find the perfect neutral balance. Now let's try a similar technique, but this time for saturation. I'll add one more node after the contrast node and name it saturation. Instead of using the standard saturation slider, which honestly feels a bit old school, let's take a smarter approach. We'll change this node's color space to HSV. HSV is a cylindrical color space that more closely matches how our eyes actually perceive color. It stands for hue, saturation, and value, and it breaks the image into 3 separate channels: channel 1 for hue, channel 2 for saturation, and channel 3 for luminance or value. Since we only want to adjust saturation, we can simply disable channels 1 and 3, leaving only channel 2 active. And here's the cool part. Your gain wheel, which normally controls exposure, is now transformed into a saturation control. And not just any saturation control, it's more intuitive, smooth, and natural than the default slider. It's a subtle trick, but it makes a big difference in how the colors feel and respond. Alright, now that we've covered primaries, which form the foundation of the color grading, let's talk about the next layer, secondaries. Secondary corrections are where things get wide open. This is the space for more creative, targeted adjustments, and it can vary a lot depending on your style, your footage, or the story you are trying to tell. I'll just walk you through a few examples from my own workflow to give you a sense of what's possible. The first thing I like to do after primaries is make some hue-based adjustments, specifically using hue versus hue or hue versus add curves. I usually set up a few parallel nodes for this, which lets me separate and control different parts of the image more easily. For example, I might slightly shift blue to make the sky look richer or tame overly saturated skin tones. And sometimes I'll mix in tools like Color Slice or Color Warper if I want more precision or a more stylized look. I won't go deep into these tools here, but just know this part of your node tree is the perfect spot for secondary color tweaks. Next, I like to add 2 or 3 more parallel nodes dedicated to spatial contrast, and by that I mean using power windows to shape the light and focus the viewer's attention. You might add a classic vignette, darken the background a bit, or isolate the subject with a soft highlight. All subtle moves that can dramatically enhance the mood or storytelling. This is where color grading becomes truly creative. There's no one right way to do it. The possibilities are endless, and it's all about supporting the image and the emotion you want to convey. The third part of my node tree is dedicated to the creative look, and this is where your imagination and style should shine. This is where you give your image a look, whether it's a subtle tweak you apply across all your clips or a bold stylized film emulation. It can be as simple as one node or a complex stack of nodes, it's totally up to you. You can play around with Resolve's built-in Film Look Creator plugin, or if you got the budget, check out third-party film emulation tools like Dehancer, Filmbox, or others. Or you can go full manual and craft your own look from scratch, which gives you the most control. In my case, I use custom LUTs I've developed myself. I know exactly how they behave and what kind of look they apply to my footage, and I've built them specifically for the DaVinci wide gamut color space. But to sum it up, the creative look section is all about freedom. Use whatever option works for you and don't be afraid to experiment. This is where your personal style comes to life. The last part of my node tree actually comes after the Rec. 709 conversion. I call this section texture, because most of the tools I use here behave more intuitively in a display-referred color space like Rec. 709. Now, there are no hard rules on how to build your workflow, but here's what I like to do. I usually apply a bit of sharpening here right after the last conversion node, but if I'm going for a softer, more filmic look, I'm actually do the opposite, a touch of de-sharpening. Then, if you are aiming for that filmic aesthetic, this is also where you can apply halation and film grain for that extra character and depth. There are also a couple of extra nodes I always include in my workflow, not a part of a main grade, but still super useful. The first one is noise reduction. I place it right at the very beginning of the node tree. Most of the time I keep it disabled during the grading to keep things running smoothly, and only enable it when I'm ready to export, especially if the footage is noisy and needs some cleanup. The second is what I call an indication node, which I place at the very end of the node tree. I use it as a visual reference to check skin tones, fine-tune exposure, and keep everything consistent across my entire timeline. And here's a little workflow trick. I make both of these nodes shared, just like we talked about earlier. That way I can quickly reuse it and update them across all my clips without needing to rebuild them manually every single time. And that's it. This is the foundation of my node tree. Once you've built your own powerhouse structure, you can save it for later use. Here's how. Just right-click in the Gallery tab, create new Power Grade album, give it a name, and then right-click on the image viewer and choose Grab Still. That's it. Now your full node structure with all the adjustments is saved as a Power Grade, ready to reuse in the future projects. I hope you learned something new, and I see you in the next one.